We are very pleased that you're here today to allow us to share with you about Barbara Drinkwater's research on women in sport. Of course, this image of Barbara Drinkwater would only be better if she was here today in person. When we planned the symposium a year ago, we didn't know that Barbara would not be able to attend for some health reasons, but we guarantee you, she's up and around and she's fine, and she'll be here again next year. We made the decision to go ahead with our symposium, even though she's not sitting right out here looking at us. When ACSM told us that they would videotape it for her, and then she would have a chance to view this symposium from home. So I thank you for joining us in this recognition, in this celebration. A program overview is that I'm going to give a start to talk about Barbara's legacy in ACSM and for women in the advancement of women in the American College of Sports Medicine. And Ann Loucks will follow up to discuss how important Barbara's mentorship has been to many women who have studied with her and learned how to do research with her mentoring. Contributions to exercise physiology research in women will be shared by Patty Freedson. And we're very fortunate to have Aurelia Nattiv discuss her involvement with Barbara in the development of the athletic triad. And last but not least, Dr. Sue Carter, who has worked with Barbara very closely on the International Olympic Committee and in the Women's Sport International, will share with you her experience in some of the important work to advance women in sport internationally. And then we'll have a wrap-up where we hope to have some of the comments from you or questions from the audience. So let me get going. I want to give you an overview of the early years in the development of the American College of Sports Medicine, because Barbara has been involved for a long, long time. Now, I don't know that she would mind if I told you that this November she will turn 90 years old. And so her legacy in ACSM is very long. So just at the start, ACSM was founded in 1954, one of their very first meetings in New York City. And the next year they changed their name to ACSM. 1961, their office was in Philadelphia under the leadership of Grover Mueller. 1962, D.B. Dill outstarts the Southwest ACSM meeting. 64, Henry Montoy moves ACSM to Michigan. Bruno Balke in 1965 moves the ACSM to Wisconsin. Just goes to show you what a fledgling early organization we were. And in 1966, Barbara Drinkwater joins ACSM. And she's been a member for 50 years. Now I thought, how do I put an asterisk on this, or an exclamation point? In 1966, I was graduating from junior high. And let me tell you, I've been around a long time. So 50 years, Barbara Drinkwater has helped to shape and mold the American College of Sports Medicine. Barbara earned her bachelor's degrees at Douglas College, which is part of Rutgers University. She earned her Master's of Science at UNC Greensboro, a very well-known women's college back then for physical education, and her PhD from Purdue University. When she was in school, she was a member of the synchronized swimming team. And we can't tell which one is Barbara, but Barbara, you know which one is you. And we studied, so anyway, Barbara, we hope that if you were here, you'd be able to point it out. In her career, she worked at UC Santa Barbara in the Department of Kinesiology and also in the Institute of Environmental Stress, followed by a move to the University of Washington in the Department of Kinesiology. And shortly thereafter, she finished her academic career and her research career at Pacific Medical Center in the Department of Medicine, where she led the osteoporosis research laboratory. It's an image of Barbara giving a VO2 max test, and look how old the equipment is. We've certainly come a long way since then. In ACSM, there is no leader that we know like Barbara Drinkwater. In the 1970s, the 80s, and the 90s, I've listed the different offices Barbara's held just to show the breadth of her involvement in the college. 1970s, member of the Board of Trustees, participating in position stands and just giving out awards and tributes. In the 1980s, growing in her involvement in committees. Barbara was part of public relations, strategic planning, the program, awards and tributes still, budget and finance, Board of Trustees, Vice President, and we always know Barbara as our very first female president. And she's always has been noted to saying, "I'm so grateful I'm not the only female president." 1990s, Barbara continued her committee work as the foundation, being on the foundation board, past president's advisory. And then she started leading many of the women's groups and international groups with the Women, Sport, and Physical Activity Strategic Health Initiative and the Women's Issues and Research Subcommittee. Barbara is a very distinguished scholar. In ACSM, she's been awarded the Citation Award, the Honor Award. She's given the Wolf Memorial Lecture and the D.B. Dale Historical Lecture. Well, that's a corfecta. In honors, she's been honored by her universities where she's studied by the University of North Carolina, Greensboro and Douglas College. She's a fellow in the National Academy of Kinesiology. And one of the big honors that many of us don't know about is in the Finnish Puyo Symposium. Barbara's been knighted by the Society of the Horse Collar. And they put a big old horse collar over your neck. And believe me, that's a big deal. Within the the former American Alliance Health, Physical Education, Recreation, and Dance, Barbara's also received all of the named lectures. She's given those, and she's received the Honor Award. So certainly someone who has contributed to our profession and our career organizations to the fullest extent. So who is Barbara Drinkwater? Where she came from? So Barbara has been a physical education teacher and a coach. She coached the field hockey team at Conrad High School, and she's off to the right-hand side as the coach. You could probably recognize her. She taught at Butler University and was a scuba instructor. She is a pilot, has her pilot's license. She has done many, many things. She's a mountaineer. She's participated in an international expedition of all women climbers to Annapurna. And Patty, I looked at the picture of Patty Freedson. Barbara has influenced many women in ACSM, many past presidents and leaders, as you can see their pictures above. Barbara was one of the early leaders in our field. She's a scientist who has shaped physical education, physical activity, and exercise science for women. She's been an incredible mentor, and she's been a leader internationally in the advancement of sports. Now, we have a project in ACSM where the leaders are interviewed that they call the Leaders Speak. And I would like to share with you this next little bit of Barbara speaking about her leadership for women in ACSM that came from her taped interview.
Change since you joined. I mean, there's been a lot of changes and I think a lot of positive things.
You know, I can't give you the numbers, the proportion of women, but it was relatively small, as I said in the beginning, and it has grown to the point where I think
it's almost 50-50.
Almost 50-50, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's encouraging to see the number of women that have gone into the field and the fact that they're welcome in ACSM. And I never felt really that there was a deliberate attempt to prevent women from moving ahead in FACSM. But there was a lot of unconscious not thinking.
Right.
And I can remember one time when I was sitting around a table with some nameless members of the executive committee, and we were talking about putting together a committee for long-range planning. And the gentleman to my left was listing the people that he wanted on the committee. And honestly, Jack, I listened to that and I got angry. And I can remember slamming my hand on the table. I was like, do you realize that you don't have a single woman on that committee?
Right.
And it wasn't deliberate.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah,
just ignoring us because you weren't thinking of us. And in some ways, that's worse than being deliberately excluded, to just be ignored because nobody even thinks about it.
Did they change the list?
Yes, they changed the list. Tim White was president at the time. He followed me. Barbara, don't get so angry. What can we do?
Right. All good.
You know, I was ready to leave. After all that time, to suddenly find that we were still being ignored.
Well, I think obviously your presidency was a real turning point.
Well, you know, it did show that the organization did not disappear.
Right.
When a woman was president. And it's very nice. For years I was introduced as the first and only president of ACSM. It's really nice now just to be the first president.
Yeah.
Woman president.
Well, yeah, you've got company now.
Yeah, lots of company.
Yeah.
Okay, well, with that, I would like to welcome Ann Loucks to the stage, and she's going to share with you the magnificence of Barbara's mentorship.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank the program committee for including this in the program at this meeting. What I'd like to do in discussing mentorship is first define scientific mentoring and talk about I'm going to focus on my experiences with Barbara at UC Santa Barbara and beyond, and discuss lessons I learned working with Barbara that I think applied to many people that Barbara had contact with. Scientific mentoring is a personal one-on-one relationship between a more experienced scientist and a junior scientist or a scientist in the making. Mentoring responsibilities include sharing knowledge and skills, overseeing the trainee's work, helping the trainee to make contact with other researchers, and assisting with career counseling. The trainee receives the guidance and encouragement necessary for professional development. Now, through my career, mentorship has become a very formal process. In my department, the chair assigns senior faculty to junior faculty, their regular meetings, their documents to guide you. Organizations like ACSM have formal programs of mentoring. Barbara was a mentor to me for over 40 years. We never sat down and established Barbara was going to be my mentor. But she, through actions, kindness, provided all those responsibilities that a mentor does. I first met Barbara when she was a research scientist at the Institute of Environmental Stress. And it was located on the top 2 floors of the Biological Sciences building on the campus of University of California, Santa Barbara. You can see the campus is located right on the coastline, and the Institute had an especially exquisite view down that coastline that I thought I would never see in my future academic career. I, at that time, was a sophomore as an undergraduate. I was leaning towards becoming a biological sciences major, but it took to the end of my sophomore year that I discovered that there was this institute in the top 2 floors of the Biological Sciences building. I set up an appointment with the director of the lab, who was Stephen Horvath, to ask what was going on at the Institute, how would you get involved in research. Dr. Horvath introduced me to a senior grad student, Mike Marin. He took me on a tour. I could see the very exciting things that were going on, the equipment labs, environmental labs, hot lab, cold lab. altitude chamber, toxicology lab, catheter lab for surgery, biochemistry lab. So the focus was characterizing humans and animals' response to various environmental stresses. Dr. Horvath also introduced me to Barbara at that time. In my meeting with Horvath, he said, well, if you really want to learn about research, you really need to do a senior thesis. And he was a busy person, director of the lab. He made it very clear that the next appropriate time for me to interact with him was when I had that senior thesis proposal in hand and would hand that to him and he would review that. My discussions with Mike Marin, I could see the grad students were very busy. I didn't see any real shadowing opportunities with the grad students, so I asked Barbara, what does one do to design a senior thesis? And Barbara's a research scientist. At this time, she doesn't have an academic appointment. She's not teaching classes. Her primary task is working on her research. She's a statistician for individuals at the Institute, but she graciously takes this sophomore under her wing, guides me to some reading, helps me plan the senior thesis, and it was done. So I became a doctoral student from 1977 to 1983. Here is a picture of this staff, postdocs, grad students at that time. This is Stephen Horvath, the director of the lab. Here is Barbara Drinkwater, the director, Barbara Drinkwater, research scientist. Here is our next speaker, Patty Freedson, who was a postdoc fellow at the time. And here is myself, very happy graduate student. So I was a grad student from 77 to 83. I focused on my research, my data collection from 1981 to 1983. This project was characterizing the endocrine responses of regularly cycling and amenorrheic women to a submax exercise bout. Here's a runner on the treadmill. You can see her right arm's bandaged, which she's got a catheter in. She's on the mouthpiece so we could dial her in. She's got a rectal thermometer in so we could characterize core body temperature. This is Dr. Horvath, who's directing my project. I think we're fixated on the output from the metabolic cart to make sure she's dialed in. The title of the project was Rose. It was one of the few words that I could see that was positive associated with menses. In the 1700s, it was thought that menstrual blood allowed for blossoming of roses. So although Barbara didn't direct graduate students, she did have research assistants that worked with her in the lab. She was the statistician that analyzed all the data collected at the Institute, and my first assignment was to be her assistant statistician. Now at this time in the 1970s, all the statistical analysis is done on a mainframe computer in the computer building located away from the Institute. Now, statistical analysis at this time is not electronic submission. It's done through something many people in the audience may have never heard of, so I put a picture. It's done through submission of punch cards. So being the assistant statistician meant that I was actually the runner, carrying batches of punch cards for Barbara several times a day to make sure that statistical analysis got done. I did move up in the world, though, and I moved on to working with Barb in the lab. At that time, her primary focus was characterizing women's physiological responses to working in the heat. And I helped with that data collection. So that's her primary focus. But Barb would be approached by various athletes who wanted to know about their physiology or wanted some guidance, and Barbara would assist these individuals. Some of those were just individual consultations. Some of those ended up in manuscripts. One person she worked with was Lynn Cox, who became a very elite cold water swimmer. Lynn and I were undergraduates together. and members of the women's swim team. I spent all my time in the pool. Lynn spent all her time in the ocean training. In high school, Lynn had done the English Channel. She had swum from Catalina to the coastline in Los Angeles, but it was clear that she had some attributes that would allow her to swim in cold water. And Barbara and I canoed beside Lynn as she swam on some longer swims along the Santa Barbara coast. And I can remember one swim in particular. I think it was in the winter. Ocean was probably in the low 50s Fahrenheit. I thought it was cold just launching the canoe off the beach. Lynn was in the water for 4 hours, and we took her core body temperature before and after, and it went up. So Lynn wanted to swim Straits of Magellan and wanted to swim the Bering Straits. Much colder bodies of water than would be in the ocean off Santa Barbara. And so a postdoc scholar at the time, Bill McCafferty, and Barbara worked hard to convince Dr. Horvath that it would be safe to bring Lynn in and collect some physiological data on her in the cold water tank at the Institute. They wanted to lower it to 42, which was what would be the temperature off the Strait of Magellan off the coast of Chile. And Horvath was still not quite sure of that. There was a defibrillator right outside the tank. The local hospital had been called in case there was any kind of problem with Lynn in this 42-degree water. But Barbara pursued convincing him that we needed to be very helpful to collect that data. Barbara also helped with the first all-female ascent of Annapurna in 1978. At 26,500 feet, this was the 10th highest mountain in the world. One of the members of that team was very concerned with all the planning they were doing, raising money to do the trip, that maybe they weren't fit and conditioned enough, and approached Barbara about whether Barbara could advise them on a conditioning program. So Barbara set up a conditioning program for the team. 8 members of that team spent 2 days at the Institute for a fitness evaluation and discussion of the physical demands of the climb. And Barbara, again, included me in some of that data collection. A few of these women in the Annapurna went on to do the first Indian and American women's ascent of Brigue Pont in 1980. And this time, Barbara went along on that trip. She was the only non-climber on the trip to collect some physiological data. And she collected that data at the base camp. The lowest base camp was at around 14,000 feet. Through my communication with Barbara, she was always emphasizing interacting with colleagues. And when I was planning my dissertation, she would always encourage me to call people up, ask them additional questions about their research beyond what was written in their manuscripts. In 1977, on campus, there was an international symposium on individual adaptations to environmental stress. It was held in honor of the director of the lab, Stephen Horvath. Here is Barbara talking to D.B. Dill. D.B. Dill, the founder, originator of the Harvard Fatigue Lab, located right here in Boston, the first accredited exercise physiology lab in North America. He was also the first non-physician president of ACSM. On the left is Chris Wells, who had been a postdoc at the Institute. At this time, Chris has moved on as a faculty member at Arizona State. She wrote a book on, 2 editions of a book on characterizing physiological responses to women in sport. Barbara provided a very critical review of a very final copy of that book. But what I remember about the conference is, this was very early when I was a grad student. There were these renowned physiologists invited to speak from around the world. And Dr. Ostrand from Stockholm, Sweden on the right, who's talking to Barbara and talking to Steve Horvath on the left. I'm not sure if this is before or after Barbara's presentation, but he was giving a talk in the work physiology section, and he presented some data on VO2 max and comparing men and women. He normalized the data to body weight. Barbara got up and challenged him on this normalization and said, wouldn't it be a more fair comparison if you normalized that oxygen uptake to fat-free mass? So Barb had a huge impact on my career, besides being so gracious, taking that time when I was a sophomore. She presented a journal club on menstrual disturbances in runners. That influenced the focus of my doctoral dissertation and research focus for many years. I also experienced her willingness to take risks, which certainly inspired me. She organized the first ACSM symposium on menstrual disturbances in athletes. This was held in 1981. This is preceding the concept of the triad by over 10 years. At that symposium, she invited Jack Wilmore to present some data. He had just finished a training study characterizing women's endocrine and menstrual responses to weeks of training. She invited a longtime distance coach of women to talk about his experiences with menstrual disturbances in his athletes. She invited a gynecologist scientist to talk about, give the review of the regulation of the reproductive system and talk about how she treated athletes with menstrual disturbances. And then she included a graduate student, me as a symposium speaker. Risk, we don't see many graduate students giving symposium talks. My job was to give the talk on what we knew in 1981 about how ovulation is disturbed and speculate about what exercise may be doing. So a very mechanistic talk, and this was before I had even published a data point. So Barbara, after Santa Barbara, created many early and mid-career opportunities for me by nominating me for ACSM committees, suggesting me as a speaker at conferences. So the mentoring continued. So lessons that I learned that I think probably apply to many people that had communicated with Barbara. Certainly in terms of research, the emphasis on excellence. With regard to data collection, working with her, you could see the advantages of very strong experimental design. You could see the advantages of well-organized protocols. And here was a lead scientist, the PI on our NIH grant, in the lab, actively involved in data collection. In her presentations, which for me began with journal clubs, but later in symposium talks, and I'm sure many people in this room always remember Barbara's presentations, very well organized, clear and succinct messages, connecting with the audience. And questions. Beginning with that 1977 question of Ostran, politely done, but firm in Barbara's questioning, and questioning throughout other sessions about aspects of doing research. As well as this research led to promoting the participation and protection of health in women in sport. Her early work at Santa Barbara, which was focusing on characterizing the responses of women working in the heat, I think was important data for establishing that women were very capable of doing the marathon and convincing IOC to allow women to run the marathon in 1984. She was advocated for including women participating in the Olympic ski jump that include in 2014 that I think we may be hearing later about, and certainly in terms of developing the concept of the Female Athlete Triad. What I also could experience is seeing a scientist who focused primarily in one area. At Santa Barbara, this was looking at characterizing women's response to the heat. When she moved up to Seattle, focusing on aspects of bone characterization. But despite that focus, she also helped others, athletes in need of physiological measurements, graduate students like myself, postdocs developing research areas, editing book chapters or books or position stands, providing opportunities for the next generation. She's also willing to take that risk. When she moved from Santa Barbara to Seattle, she switched research areas. Throughout that, she always emphasized, even though we would be intense in terms of activities we'd be doing in the lab, always taking time to enjoy the process. So, thank you to Barbara.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, it's a real, I feel very privileged to have been asked to give this presentation about Barb's research. And for that, Barb Ainsworth, I thank you for that invitation. And it's an area that, what I'm going to be talking about today, I actually, if you think about it, I don't really know anything about other than what I might have learned in the classroom. Now, that's not a good thing for a presenter to say, right? I'm sort of setting myself up for failure. However, it was a great experience for me to actually go back and look at Barb's research history and the story that that history tells, and studying it actually like a student, which I haven't been for a lot of years. So it was a good experience. So I feel smarter today than I did yesterday. So I want to start off with highlighting a paper that Barb and Steve Horvath published back in 1971. This was one of her earliest papers that I could find, and it wasn't on thermoregulation or menstrual dysfunction or bone, but it was a paper that described the responses of young female track athletes to exercise. And back in 71, just to give you perspective, I'm currently an older woman, an older adult. In 71, I graduated high school. So it's a little bit later than what Barb Ainsworth was talking about earlier. In this study, they were interested in looking at the feasibility of actually taking a track workout that was done out on the track and simulating it in the lab, and to compare VO2 max to metabolic responses in a simulated track workout. And third, to compare high school female track athletes to age-matched girls from other populations. Now, this was I found this particularly innovative. You know, that's always a word that you have to address when writing grant applications. How is this innovative? And if this had been a grant application, I think Barb could have addressed this by saying, well, everything's innovative, because it really was. And in particular, back in 1971, in their wisdom and creativity, they were interested and successfully created an ecologically valid protocol. And we hear a lot about that today, doing studies in the natural environment, in the free living settings, so that we really can understand people's responses to different exposures and look at the outcomes related to those exposures. So back in 71, she was interested in creating an ecologically valid protocol by translating a track workout practice to the lab setting. So they went out and monitored what track practices looked like, and that's shown here. And for those of you who had some rest periods, warm up, where there was a slow jog and then 6 repeats of 100-yard dashes, et cetera, et cetera. So this was characterizing the track workout. And then compare the physiological responses to that track workout to a maximum aerobic power test. And you can see the actual descriptive data on heart rate, VO2 max or VO2, workload, lactate responses, and at the time, oxygen debt under those two different situations. And then the figures on the right, particularly the one on the far right, actually describe the oxygen consumption responses for each of the individual events simulated in the laboratory, simulating those track events. And I thought this was fairly, not just fairly, but very innovative to describe these responses of girls under those two different conditions. A paper that Barb published in the first volume of Exercise and Sports Science Reviews was entitled Physiological Responses of Women to Exercise. And I want to take a moment to actually read the intro or abstract to that, but certainly a part of the summary of the paper, not really a summary, but an introduction or context for the paper. As more and more women take advantage of opportunities to participate in physically demanding activities, and remember this is 1973, interest in how they respond physiologically has increased. Extension of civil rights legislation to encompass equality of the sexes has made available to women a number of jobs which require considerable physical exertion. Do the standards set for the safety of men who work in a hot environment apply equally to women? So you can begin to see sort of this inquiry about heat stress. How does age affect the ability of women to perform physical tasks? Does the menstrual cycle affect the physical work capacity of women? So even though her research in the early 70s and mid-70s didn't deal with menstrual function, there certainly was some thoughts about this exciting event that women experience every month and how that relates to performance. In this very lengthy review paper, she talks about sex differences in VO2 max and submaximal work, aging, female athletes, training effects, energy expenditure, exercise in the heat, the menstrual cycle, and altitude effects. So studying some environmental stresses, as well as looking at the older adult response, female athletes, as well as sex differences. So pretty advanced thinking back in 1973. So what I want to do for the duration of this rest of the duration of this presentation is to talk about Barbara's main research themes that she studied over her career. And I have at the bottom, the main focus was in women in sport and exercise, with the three themes being characterized by studying thermoregulation and exercise, menstrual function, bone health and exercise, and even in the area of exercise, aging, and health. And I'll go through some examples, certainly not all of her papers, but show you some examples of this work as we move along. So one paper that was published with colleagues at the Institute of Environmental Stress that Annie talked about earlier was aerobic power. That aerobic power was a factor in women's response to work in the hot environment. Attempting to answer two questions. Is VO2 max important in thermoregulation in women during exercise in hot environments, as well as do the physiological responses to exercise in the heat differ among women who have a high VO2 max versus those who have a low VO2 max? And these are some of the data from that study, descriptive data. In the table, you can see there were 6 athletes and 6 non-athletes, with a fairly sizable difference in VO2 max. And then in the figures on the right are illustrations of core temperature responses under 3 different environmental conditions: in thermal-neutral environment and progressively hotter environments among the athletes and non-athletes. And while there were no significant differences seen at the lower temperatures, you do see some differences at 35 degrees centigrade, with the athletes actually responding with a higher core temperature, although Barbara was very careful to point out this was not statistically significant. And then interestingly, at the highest temperature, the women with the low VO2 max were not able to complete the entire set of work tasks. As many of you, many of us older individuals recall, there was a pretty famous conference that was held in the early 80s called the Marathon: Physiological, Medical, Epidemiological, and Psychological Studies. Speakers at this conference included the main players in our field: D.B. Dill, Banks Saltine, Phil Golnick, Ethan Nadal, Gisolfi, Costel, Mitchell, Dempsey. All of these are names that we all know from research that they did, as well as in classes that we took in exercise physiology: Loring Rowell, Pollack, Wilmer, Baldwin, Booth, Halazzi, Leon, Raven, all men, but Barbara Drinkwater was there too. And she spoke in a section of that program called Similarities and Dissimilarities Among Men and Women Distance Runners. And unlike the other papers in this document that was published by the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences and who sponsored this big meeting, Barb actually did a study where she looked at heat tolerance of female distance runners as opposed to doing just review papers. And this was a cross-sectional study that actually looked at thermoregulatory responses to an acute heat stress in marathon runners and controls who were matched for body size. And body size was a very important issue for her, as Annie Loucks pointed out earlier. If you're going to be comparing men and women, that body size and the appropriate body size adjustments need to be made. These are some of the blood volume and plasma volume not response differences, but characteristics between the marathoners and controls. Now you can see some very distinct and very large differences in blood volume, plasma volume, hemoglobin. Mean corpuscular hemoglobin volume was not significant, but by the vast majority, all the indicators of capacity for carrying oxygen as well as plasma and blood volume were quite different between the two groups of women, marathoners versus controls. These are showing some of the cardiovascular responses, and I direct your attention to the right side. And what this basically shows is that as temperature increased, the ability of the control subjects, or the lower, not the athletes, for stroke volume could not maintain some of the cardiovascular features that are necessary in order to sustain work being done. In terms of the significance and impact of this particular study, this was one of the first studies to suggest that it's important to consider aerobic power as an independent variable when sex differences in physiological responses to exercise in the heat are examined. In other words, if you're going to be looking at sex differences and during exercise in the heat, that workloads be set according to VO2 max and as a relative percent of VO2 max. However, she also showed that VO2 max didn't completely eliminate the effect of differences between the groups of different levels of aerobic power at the highest heat stress, and it also appeared that higher VO2 max women were better able to adapt to high heat stress. And that seemed to be a function of the fact that the lower VO2 max women who had lower blood volume actually were unable to maintain stroke volume. Okay, then we move to the second area of research that Barbara focused in, which was menstrual function, bone health, and exercise. And I highlight a paper that she published with her colleagues in 1984 that examined bone mineral content of amenorrheic and eumenorrheic athletes. And the question being addressed in this study was, is chronic low estrogen state, is that state observed in amenorrheic athletes? When you see that, is that also associated with low bone density? So it's basically a descriptive paper, but an incredibly important one, where she had two groups of female athletes, normal menstruating and amenorrheic athletes, and she measured bone density. At that time, she used a single photon absorptiometry method on the radius and a dual photon absorptiometry method on lumbar 1 to 4. And those were the actual sites where measurements were made. You can see in the table among the amenorrheic athletes had not had their normal menstrual function for over 41 months, and they ran substantially, almost double the amount of mileage that the normal menstruating athletes ran. But they were similar in all other physical characteristics. So this could really isolate menstrual status as a potential factor for if there would be bone density differences seen. And sure enough, while no differences were seen in the radius in this study, there were significantly lower bone density measures observed in the amenorrheic athletes. And if you look at the hormonal levels between those two groups, you see sizable differences in estrogen, progesterone, and as well as prolactin. So while a cross-sectional study that this was really the first set of data to suggest that there is an association between menstrual dysfunction and bone density in young female athletes. So in addition, I think it had a significant effect in showing that exercise and estrogen both interact with one another to affect bone density, but that it didn't appear that the exercise that these women did could in any way totally account for the lower estrogen levels in the amenorrheic runners. This is certainly was indication that many more questions came out of this as opposed to answers, which is always a cool thing to have happen in research. But there was also a caution that she indicated in this paper that one should not interpret this to stop high-volume exercise training. And the second paper that I want to highlight was published in '86 by Barb and her colleagues, looking at, well, what happens when normal menses returns, what happens to bone density? And she followed some of the women from the first study over many months in a prospective fashion. Some of those women who had been amenorrheic regained their menses. Some remained amenorrheic, just 2 of them actually, and then there was a group also that she compared them to who had regular cycles. And if you look at the figure on the right, these are individual data. I think it's one of the first papers that I saw that really didn't just look at means here, but I think you can gain some interesting insight looking at individual responses. Those that regained menses now after having been amenorrheic for so many months, in every case except one, the bone density values increased. The women who had normal menses throughout the entire study period, there were some variable responses. A couple of them went down and a couple stayed the same. And then the 2 women who remained amenorrheic over the following 15 months continued to lose bone density. So what she observed in this study with her group was a partial reversal in bone loss with resumption of normal menses, and this was likely mediated by increases in estrogen. The resumption was actually brought about by reduction in training volume and also some gain in body weight. And to me, and some of the people that work in the area of energy availability could correct me, but to me this seemed like the very early evidence suggesting the importance of energy availability in the regulation of menstrual function, given the changes in weight that seem to be related to resumption resumption of normal menses. And finally, there was a study that was a very interesting study in the same group, Barbara leading the group all the way as the pioneer she was, looking at menstrual history as a determinant of current bone density in young athletes. And she had 3 groups of individuals answering the question, are historical and current menstrual history associated with current bone density in athletes? And she had a group 1 that were regular all the time, group 2 that were regular but then also experienced some menstrual dysfunction, and then group 3 who had menstrual dysfunction throughout the historical analysis. So we're going from the group 1, which is normal, and group 3 having the most significant irregularities with regard to menses. So if you look at on the x-axis here, looking at different menstrual groups and bone mineral density on the y-axis, you see a classic, couldn't even be more classic, dose response, that the more significant the menstrual dysfunction, the more significant, or not change in bone density, but the lower the bone density. And that's also shown in the table that looked at different sites for bone mineral density in the 3 menstrual groups. So a dose response that was pretty nice to see, that kind of straightforward dose response. This was the first study to really show a dose in this case meaning level of menstrual dysfunction from none to worse. First study to show a dose response, and the response is the bone mineral density in young athletes. Now, this was a retrospective analysis, so there are some limitations, but again, some of the first early work and certainly suggestive of this relationship, that there's increased risk of osteoporosis in female athletes who have extended periods of time with amenorrhea. So the third area that I highlighted at the beginning is exercise, aging, and health. And I'm not going to go through any specific studies in this area, but simply to show you the scope of the work that was done by Barbara and her colleagues related to some things I've already talked about, but also some work just looking at the aerobic power of females across the lifespan from 10 to 68. That was done with Barb and Steve Horvath and Christine Wells. Another review that was in Exercise and Sports Science Reviews in 1984, Women in Exercise Physiological Aspects, Exercise and Aging, the Female Masters Athlete. That was in a textbook called Sports Science Perspectives for Women. Heat tolerance and aging, so here combining aging with the concept of her work on thermoregulation, and then some work that was done with Annie Loucks looking at how sweating sensitivity and capacity of women in relation to age. So I characterize this work not in thermoregulation, but rather more in the area of exercise, aging, and health. So I want to close here with something that appeared in Barb's local newspaper, and she lives on an island off the coast of Seattle called the Vashon, I don't think I'm saying that right, Maury Island Beachcomber. That's their big newspaper, like the equivalent of the New York Times, but on Vashon Island. And there was a headline in this paper called "The President's Council Recognizes Islander for Her Pioneering Research." Longtime island resident Barbara Drinkwater was honored last month in Washington by the President's Council on Physical Fitness and Sports and Nutrition. And Barb's quote, "I'm very grateful to the group for," in her always very classy way, "I'm very grateful to the group for having chosen me for one of the awards," Drinkwater said recently. And then in her down-to-earth Barbara Drinkwater way, "This is going to be a big surprise on Vashon, where a lot of people think all I can do is rescue cats and dogs." So I just thought I would share that quote with you. I thought that was so Barbara. So to summarize, Barbara's legacy, certainly known for her pioneering research career, highly acclaimed, international leader in the field, an incredible role model, as we heard earlier from Annie Loucks, and mentor for women scientists, always thinking, even in those times, innovation and discovery was at a different level than it is now. But at that time, the way she conducted her work, the way she described and interpreted her results, the statistical rigor with which she analyzed her results certainly was innovative and contained many new discoveries. And her work certainly has had some significant translational value. And even more important, I think, is the social implications of her work related to gains towards equality for girls and women in sport and physical activity. And that impact has been tremendous. So in general, or in specifically, she's had an extraordinary research portfolio that has high impact in our field, as well as in medicine and for girls and women in sport and physical activity. So I'm showing a different view of Santa Barbara than Annie Loucks did, but just to sort of, in an illustrative way, talk about Barbara Drinkwater's timeline in her contributions. The work she did in exercise, aging, and health spanned from between the 70s and the mid-90s, and most of that work was done in Santa Barbara, although a little bit of it up in Seattle. She also, in the 70s and 80s, conducted the research on women's athletic performance and thermoregulation in Santa Barbara, and then moving a little bit north to Seattle and Pacific Medical Center and the University of Washington is where she began, as Annie said, a whole new research career research focus in menstrual function, hormonal changes in exercise, and osteoporosis. And then finally, a lot of the work that took place in Seattle related to the menstrual function, hormonal changes, osteoporosis, we all know has led to this significant and major translatable piece of work called the Female Athlete Triad. And I will end there, and our next speaker will talk about that. So, Aurelia, why don't you come up here? Thank you for your attention.
Well, I'm honored to be part of this symposium honoring Barbara. She had a very pivotal role in my career, and I'm not Rosemary Agostini. She was unable to make it, but I'm Aurelia Nattiv, and I'm again very honored to talk about Barbara's role in the development of the Female Athlete Triad. So the overview of my presentation, I'll discuss the origins of the Female Athlete Triad, Barbara's mentorship of young female physicians, the 1992 think tank meeting in Washington, D.C. On the Female Athlete Triad, the first paper in 1993 describing the Female Athlete Triad, and the ACSM position stands in 1997 and 2007, and the most recent publication of the 2014 Female Athlete Triad Coalition Consensus Statement on Female Athlete Triad Treatment and Return to Play. Barbara was involved, very, very involved in all of these. In the 1950s and 60s, there were several papers published on menstrual disorders noted in female athletes, particularly Olympians. In the 1970s, increasing focus on menstrual disturbances in athletes, particularly cross-country runners. The classic Shangold marathon training paper, which described the relationship between long-distance running, plasma progesterone, and luteal phase length. The luteal phase was shorter and progesterone decreased as training mileage increased. The paper by Dr. Bullen, which was the first randomized controlled trial to demonstrate the effects of exercise training and weight loss on menstrual function. Sedentary college-age women training to run 10 miles per day for 2 complete menstrual cycles. Women were randomly assigned weight loss and weight maintenance groups. Weight loss was associated with severe menstrual disturbances. In the 1980s, papers by Brownell and Wilmore on eating, body weight, and body weight practices in athletes. There was the book by Brownell, Roden, and Wilmore that had a series of papers on eating behaviors in athletes, and papers by Rosen, some of the first papers describing the pathogenic weight control behaviors in gymnasts. Joran Sangap-Organ in the 1990s began publishing her papers and her significant contributions of disordered eating behaviors increasingly prevalent in female athletes and those involved in sports that emphasize leanness or low body weight. The 1990s featured continued research on the menstrual cycle, disordered eating, and bone health to include the appearance of well-controlled experiments and an increasing number of papers documenting stress fractures as well in the female athlete. And Patty had illustrated a number of the papers by Barbara that highlighted the bone outcomes. In 1984, the paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, amenorrheic athletes have lower bone density than eumenorrheic athletes in the lumbar spine. In 1986, the paper in JAMA, the resumption of menses was the primary factor associated with a significant increase in lumbar spine bone density of former amenorrheic athletes that Patty discussed. And the 1990 paper that we reviewed, menstrual history was a significant determinant of bone density in athletes, with extended periods of amenorrhea having a residual effect on bone density. And the 1996 JAMA paper that extended periods of amenorrhea may result in low bone density not only in the lumbar spine, but at multiple skeletal sites, including those sites that were subject to impact loading during exercise. So as we know, Barbara was the first female president of ACSM, and it was in 1988 to 1989. I was just completing my sports medicine fellowship then, and I remember being at the meeting when Barbara spoke. We all know she's an icon, and she has that presence about her. There were few female physicians in the United States at that time that, well, actually in the world, that had completed primary care sports medicine fellowships, because it was a very new field. And we were all just starting to join ACSM. I was at UCLA with Dr. Jim Puffer, and he encouraged me to join ACSM, and that's when I met Barbara. She was a role model and mentor to all of the, especially the female physicians. We were all just, in awe of her. She took a strong interest in mentoring us, and she really challenged us to step up. And like Anne was saying, ask questions, get involved, join the committees, do the research. She was kind of like our mom. She also challenged us to do more. She challenged us to do more speaking and to get out there more. And again, she noted that there weren't that many women speakers at ACSM, and she really wanted the female physicians to get out there. So Rosemary Agostini, who lived nearby Barbara and has known Barbara for a long time, took the charge, and she organized a meeting in 1991 called the Medical and Orthopedic Concerns of the Female Athlete in Seattle, and had, I think it was 24 speakers, all women, primary care physicians and scientists. And she just, she followed Barbara's lead, and that's actually when we first started talking about the concepts of the triad and sharing stories. We were sharing stories about, how we were seeing all these women, these female athletes that had disordered eating amenorrhea. They were presenting with stress fractures, and there had to be some kind of a connection. And sharing the stories with each other was really, it was just really interesting that we were all kind of seeing the same thing at the same time. So that's when the initial concepts originated at that meeting. Barbara encouraged us to continue in the path of exploring what is going on. So Kim Yeager, Rosemary Agostini, and myself, along with Barbara, continued to, again, discuss this constellation of symptoms, and we wanted to try and find a name for, what is this? What kind of, is it a syndrome? What is going on? So we discussed various possibilities, and Kim Yeager came up with the Female Athlete Triad, and when she said that, our eyes just kind of popped open, and it's like, that's it. And Barbara, gave blessings on that, and that's kind of when the term was coined. So Barbara really helped to pave the path of the Female Athlete Triad, disordered eating, amenorrhea, and osteoporosis. And as a group, we discussed holding a think tank meeting and wanted it to be in a place that would get a lot of exposure. And Barbara suggested DC. We discussed having a call to action. Apparently, there was a little inside story that I guess the DC option, there was some controversy about that, but Barbara again took her shoe at one of the meetings, I think it was one of the board meetings, and she went like that, it's gonna be in DC, and it was in DC. So we were the co-chairs, and congresswomen were involved. Patricia Schroeder in particular attended, and that was one of the reasons she wanted it in DC. Let's get more exposure, let's get the Congress people involved, so it did receive national attention. It was actually on CNN, there were reporters there. Jim Whitehead was very supportive of having it there, and it was just a really exciting time. And it really takes a village. This is one of those things, there were so many people involved, and everybody really stepped up, and there was just a lot of people that were supporting this initiative. So this was in 1992, and this was the commentary that subsequently was published in 1993 from this meeting. That's Mimi Johnson, who was also one of those in the village that was speaking on eating disorders, and we'll talk about, this was before the internet days of email, and Rosemary happened to still have an original program and she scanned it and sent it to me so that I can go over, what we actually went over at that think tank meeting that was 2 days. So this was the general session. We had a morning session and afternoon session. Barbara was she gave the welcoming talk in that morning, and then we had the Congresswoman Patricia Schroeder that gave a talk on a call for health equity on the Hill. This was followed by Kim Yeager, who spoke on the female athlete triad, disordered eating, amenorrhea, and osteoporosis, the magnitude of the problem. And then we actually had Olga Corbett come as well, who I'm sure many of you know was an Olympic gymnast in the 70s, and another athlete, Jennifer Mangum. They both shared their stories about anorexia and bulimia and how common it was in sport. Jack Wilmore was there, and he spoke about losing to win. A psychologist that works closely with Dr. Mimi Johnson spoke about disordered eating. That was Dr. Maria Root. And Kathy Engelbert Fenton, who was a dietitian, spoke about some of the issues with regards to disordered eating and progression to anorexia and bulimia. And then Angela Smith, orthopedic surgeon, former president of ACSM, spoke about, she actually just facilitated that morning session, and so she was there as well. The afternoon session included Dr. Loucks speaking on athletic amenorrhea and shared some of her studies. Barbara spoke on old bones in young athletes, and Bob Marcus, who's an endocrinologist and worked closely with Barbara, was also there, and he facilitated that discussion. And Mimi Johnson spoke about the team physician's role and the emerging conflict, who is in charge. These were some of the players: Rosemary, Barbara, Connie LeBrun, and Christine Wells is on the far right. The afternoon session included a coach, Coach Greg Marsden, who was at the University of Utah and was the head coach for the U.S. gymnastics at that time. He spoke as well. And then we had athletic administrators, Joan Cronin and Gretchen von Loh-Krutter, and Carol Otis, who was very involved in this as well, facilitated that afternoon session. Then we had representation from the USOC, Carol Meredith from the NCAA, Dr. Elizabeth Arndt, and Susan True from the High School Association, and Elizabeth Gallup, who many of you probably remember. She's a physician and an attorney, spoke on the liabilities of physicians, coaches, and administration and athletic associations with regards to the triad. And that session in the afternoon was facilitated by Rosemary. The next day, Carol Otis led a session on prevention, while Barbara led the session on research, and Sally Harris, primary care sports medicine physician, led the session on health consequences. Jack Wilmore facilitated the workshops, and each workshop facilitator presented together at that morning session. The afternoon session included Michelle Warren, who, of course, I'm sure many of you know, has done a lot of the pivotal work as well with regards to amenorrhea and negative effects on bone, especially in ballet dancers. And so she spoke on medical care. Rosemary spoke on education, national, regional, and sports governing bodies. And Dr. Suzanne Tanner at the time was a primary care sports medicine physician, later became an orthopedic surgeon. And Angela Smith ran the workshop interactions and facilitated the discussion. So it was quite a group. We also had a call to action, and this is just a copy of the call to action, which was also disseminated through ACSM about the female athlete triad. And this was the list of speakers that we spoke about. So in the 1993 commentary that was published, that was the first publication resulting from the 1992 think tank meeting, the main messages was the high prevalence of disordered eating. At that time, it was up to 62%, depending on the sport. The high prevalence of amenorrhea from 3 to 66%. Osteoporosis observed consisted of premature bone loss, inadequate bone formation, bone loss observed may be rapid and not completely reversible. Other key statements in that publication that most athletes are at risk, particularly elite athletes. Non-athletes also may be affected by a similar syndrome. Male athletes may similarly be impacted, but not enough data at that time. Discussion on psychological pressures, training pressures, inadequate nutrition was an important factor as well, and a need for a position stand to be developed. So that was in 1993. The first position stand was 4 years later, in 1997, and Carol Otis chaired that position statement. Barbara was an author, as well as Mimi Johnson, Ann Loucks, Jack Wilmore as well. And again, that was the disordered eating, amenorrhea, and osteoporosis triangle that we're all familiar with. I'm just going to go on with a couple of the other studies that followed in the progression from 1997 to 2007, were the second position stand. So it was Dr. Loucks' Excalibur studies, Nancy Williams' monkey studies, D'Souza's menstrual cycle studies, and D'Souza and Williams' metabolic studies. Dr. Loucks' studies, the luteinizing hormone pulsatility study, that the disruption of LH pulsatility occurred at a threshold of energy availability below 30 kilocalories per kilogram of lean body mass per day. Menstrual function is dependent on energy availability as indicated by the use of LH pulsatility as a surrogate marker of menstrual function. These fancy slides are by Mary Jane D'Souza. So thank you, Mary Jane. The second one was the dose-response relationships between energy availability and bone turnover in young exercising women, with the effects of energy availability, including bone resorption, increasing when energy availability was low enough to suppress estradiol. Bone formation was suppressed at much higher energy availabilities, and the effects on collagen formation paralleled the effects on insulin. Effects on calcium binding paralleled the effects on T3 and IGF-1. Nancy Williams studies. So Nancy trained monkeys. She trained monkeys to run on a treadmill and found that amenorrhea was induced by increasing exercise energy expenditure without reducing dietary energy intake. Amenorrhea was reversed by dietary supplementation without moderating the exercise regimen. And Dr. D'Souza's studies outlining the increase and emphasizing the increased severity of response, including the subtle menstrual disturbances, progressing on to the more severe clinical menstrual disturbances of oligomenorrhea and amenorrhea. The reductions in energy availability or energy deficiency that result in a cascade of alterations in resting energy expenditure and metabolic hormones indicative of energy deficiency. The Active Women study showing the severity of energy-related menstrual disturbances increases in proportion to indices of energy conservation in exercising women. So finally, the most recent position statement in 2007, again, 10 years after the first one, and I had the opportunity to work very closely with Ann Loucks, with Jorn Sunga-Borgen, with Melinda Menor, and Charlotte Sanborn, and Michelle Warren. And it was an honor to chair this position statement. One of the main concepts that came from that was the spectrum of energy availability, menstrual status, and bone mineral density. The level of evidence was also outlined in this paper, with level A evidence being severe undernutrition impairs reproductive and skeletal health, menstrual irregularities and low bone density increase stress fracture risk, disordered eating, eating disorders, and amenorrhea occur more frequently in sports that emphasize leanness. The level B evidence, to diagnose functional hypothalamic amenorrhea, other causes must be excluded. Treatment for disordered eating and eating disorders includes nutritional counseling and individual psychotherapy. Cognitive behavioral group therapy and/or family therapy may also be used. Nutritional and endocrine factors that set the stage for low bone density, again, the emphasis on energy deficiency and the cascade of physiological adaptations to conserve fuel, leading to skeletal demineralization. And pointing out that the recovery of energy status can take days or weeks, while the recovery of menstrual status may take months, and the recovery of bone mineral density may take years. So just emphasizing that it's that, just the time difference in all of these, and that's why the incidence of all three components may not be as high at one time as one may think, but because of the the recovery and time process of each. And the most recent paper, which Barbara was also very involved with, was the 2014 Female Athlete Triad Coalition Consensus Statement on Treatment and Return to Play of the Female Athlete Triad. There were two international conferences, the first held in San Francisco and the second in Indianapolis. And Barbara was at both of those, and she was an expert panel member. And the main result of this paper was the cumulative risk assessment, looking at cumulative risk along with magnitude of risk, helping physicians to have a risk assessment to use for clearance and return to play guidelines in conjunction with clinical judgment. And Barbara was again very helpful in our development of these guidelines. So research on the female athlete triad has paved the way for the effective female athlete to seek education, prevention, and treatment. And we thank Barbara Drinkwater for helping us to get all the way to where we are now. I think we've come a long way from 1992. So thank you, Barbara. Thank you very much.
All right. I'm Susan Carter, and I'm besides being a fellow, I have to explain what these are because some people don't know. I'm a fellow of the American College of OB/GYN, although I'm just GYN, no OB, no deliveries. And I quit that in 1989, and I'm also a fellow of the American College of Surgeons. So Barbara, I know she's watching this. I think it was really cute how nervous Ann Loucks was before she got up here. And she was like, I was like, Ann, this is fun. This is, for Barbara, this is like a recognition. She goes, yeah, but it's Barbara. So I think that you never get over being the student. So my two aspects include Women's Sport International and International Olympic Committee. Everyone knows, or most people know, that Barb is a fan of gourmet jelly beans. I consider some of the colors of Barbara Drinkwater, not just the facets and not just her research. I'll go over a little bit of background, some random factoids, some controversies that she's, as you've heard, happily involved in, some of her contributions, a few quotes, and I have a few photos like everybody else, some are the same, and her impact. I met Barb in fall of 1982 at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, where I was doing some work. I had been one of the athletes that you've heard about on this study when I was running for University of Texas in the 70s. So my coach was Jack Daniels, who was an altitude exercise physiologist. Some of you are nodding, you know who he is. And so Jack, of course, in the scientific interest, had us running massive miles, no miles, altitude, no altitude, heat, everything, and we were always reporting our data, especially of our menstrual activities. So that's kind of got my interest sparked as an undergraduate in a lot that happened with the menstrual cycle in women. At the time, Karen Carpenter was pretty visible as her struggles with anorexia and bulimia. She did die in 83 at age 32, and you can see her here on the right when she was 83 pounds. Bulimia research was really becoming more prevalent and an awareness in 1979, which had not been really studied much before. We had boycotted the 1980 Olympic Games in Moscow. You can see the ominous black and red insignia down below. And this session was on oligoamenorrhea and bone health. And we had this red pamphlet called the Athletic Amenorrhea Bulletin. I couldn't find a copy of it, but we worked on that. It was pretty, it was a pretty basic, simple, but starting to get interest in a lot of what was going on with these issues. And I figured that we're probably the early Title IX generation people. Barbara didn't get to or participate much in organized sports because there was no Title IX for her, but she certainly obviously helped pave the way for many others. By June of '72, Title IX, I added 3 years for high school, 3 years for college, and 4 years for medical school. So I was probably one of the first physicians out trying to do something affected by Title IX, and I feel very fortunate. And Barb and I have talked about that many times. Or were we really at the Olympic Training Center in '82 because there were a lot of hot guys, martial arts, and they were also training at the same time we were there, and it was sponsored by Miller High Life, which Barb and I do know intimately. You've seen the photo of scuba. Both of us were really scuba enthusiasts back in our day. I consider we had the hydrophilic bond. My maiden name was Waterfield. She's Drinkwater. We're both island girls. And I'm born and raised in Galveston Island, and she on Vashon Island. Yes, she was a flight instructor while she was at UCSB. She upgraded her private pilot license to a commercial and an instrument flight instructor, which I think is fairly amazing, amongst all this other stuff she's doing. And if you'll notice the timeline, a lot of it's overlapping. So she's doing many different things at many places. So you thought the last, Patty said the earliest study she could find was in the 70s. Here's one from '67. The members performed while the 99s, as you see this red sign, the 99s are an international organization of women pilots, of which Barbara was a member. And she conducted a study with Maureen Leonard titled Speed and Accuracy in Decision Responses of Men and Women Pilots, published in the Department of Physical Education at UC Santa Barbara. Anyway, I did think this was interesting. This is a newsletter that the 99s had, and the all-women transcontinental air race, the AWTAR, had 11 members, and Margaret Mead was a Santa Barbara member, and she won in 1968, and yada, yada. But in '69, one of the compatriots of Barbara was Joan Steinberger, and she added 20 minutes to her time in her race by staying aloft to help a contestant orient her position and get down safely. So think about that next time you watch somebody helping a distance runner to the finish line. That's pretty heroic, and she received a Good Sportsman Award for that. And here, we always can't tell which one's Barbara, because it's hard to say back then. I think she's on the far right again. But it says, here's the little newsletter chatting on and on about, their casseroles and their registration booth and all this. And then it says that the San Joaquin Valley chapter thrilled thousands of spectators with their wing-walking exhibitions with Carol Bloom and Barbara Drinkwater of the Santa Barbara chapter. And this was kind of, a lot of these are just perspectives and talks. I interviewed Barbara over, many years and months of specifically what she would want to have sort of recognized. Some of it I did not include. But having breakfast with Carrie Fasting in Melbourne at a conference, came up with a need for the group Women's Sport International called WSI. Celia Breckenridge and Libby Darlson joined us, and off we went. And here are the founding members of Women's Sport International. Marion Lay also joined in, and that's a pretty good group right there. So their goal was really to act as an evidence-based advocacy group on the international stage, to work with sport bodies and kind of politically help, and I think this last quote, which I italicized, get it done. Does that sound like Barbara or what? So it's their foresight that's helped expand women's organizations around the world for sport, and to increase opportunities for girls and women to participate in sport and physical activity around the world. And this organization has been tireless at trying to accomplish these efforts. It's both an issues and action-based organization. There's over 30 countries represented: sports science, medicine, health and fitness, nutrition, coaching, admin, education, trying to make sport and physical activity an ongoing part of females and their lives. 2013, we had a joint conference, WSI and ACSM, and to identify and rectify some of these barriers that I was just discussing to participation of girls and women in physical activity and sport. And we had a conference in Indianapolis, which I think was successful at that time. Then on Tuesday here in Boston, we just had another conference that was a joint session between WSI and ACSM, because UNESCO just had a newly revised international sport charter, and they're going to be presenting that soon. So we had some input, and I think it was a really good discussion. We also updated the Memorandum of Understanding from 2012 and made it more formalized between ACSM and Women's Sport International. And I thank Jim Whitehead and Liz Joy for coming by and helping make that an official document. So I do think Ani and Susan did a great job in organizing that, and Barb was very sorely missed, rarely misses a WSI meeting, and everyone did wish Barbara their very best from that organization. Quote, in '87, Sue, when I was president-elect, I had the task of selecting new members. There wasn't any black member on any committee, so I formed a new committee tasked with identifying and recruiting black members for the various committees. That committee is now known as Diversity, and Nicole Keith just recently ran for president. So she's very proud of her championing of diversity, which has been a lifelong interest of hers. So here's Nicole herself, along with Toby Tate, enjoying a beverage. 1993, WSI ACSM with leadership equality. This is the same kind of slapping the table. I think we all have heard this. It's various renditions throughout time, but it is very attention-catching, and was trying to make sure women were involved on this committee, which you can see the actual participants are pretty stern. We love this photo because she's always smiling, she's always laughing, and if you know Barbara, she's got a great sense of humor and lots of smiling and laughing and trying to make things very enjoyable along the way. She was president, as you heard, and in 1998 she was treasurer, that she held position for a very long time, of Women's Sport International. In 2005 she served as vice president from then. Well, I asked her, and I think this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I asked her, what about the Female Athlete Triad? And she said, well, I was at Yosemite National Park, and I went to a meeting with Jim Whitehead and Ann Loucks, and we decided to name it. So here's the three of them traveling along in Yosemite. In 1995, a forum at WSI, she was pointing out that, and she sent me this, that she was really trying to make an educational program. So this is an official correspondence to Arnie Lundquist and Dr. Montag about a symposium that was going to occur, because she really wanted to make sure that sports governing bodies make education mandatory for their coaches about the Female Athlete Triad. And that was in 1995. So in 2005, at an International Olympic Committee conference, protecting the health of the athlete is the primary goal of the Medical Commission, and there were two consensus conferences Barb was involved in, especially the effect of the Female Athlete Triad on the health and performance of the female athlete, and there were others involved with training the elite child athlete. 2013, we were invited by the IOC to update the Female Athlete Triad, and came up with an entity known as Relative Energy Deficiency in Sport. I think Aurelia has done a great job of explaining a lot of the energy deficiency issues. But it was a very nice experience in Lausanne, and Barbara, as I see Joran and Connie here, was an honorary attendee, and we missed her sorely as well. Regarding the relative energy deficiency in sport and female athlete triad, you know, Barb's a diplomat. Update is good. She's always positive. It shouldn't matter what you call it, and REDS is more accurate than FAT because I've always recognized that men suffer from almost the same thing. The well-being of the athlete is the most important thing anyway. As long as everyone is getting the word out there and these athletes get help, that's what's important. And I think that's a very well-stated point. One of the other controversies or issues that Barbara got involved in with, of course, was sexual harassment. And the IOC had a consensus statement on sexual harassment and abuse in sport. I think you've seen recently some of the coaching issues that have come out in the last couple of days. But the executive board of the IOC has adopted a consensus statement on sexual harassment and abuse in sport. And it's a unique document defining problems and risk factors and some guidelines for actual resolution of the issue. And we mentioned a little bit about the ski jumping and reproductive injuries. The head of the International Ski Federation in 2008 stated that ski jumping was just too dangerous for women because he thought that the woman's uterus might burst during the landing. So here we have at the bottom a male 4-time world champion. Can you not get hurt if you're a male in ski jumping? I think it's pretty dangerous for pretty much anyone regardless of your gender, but your uterus is not going to rupture. So we met in Baltimore and had another joint WSI-ACSM meeting and reviewed a lot of literature and developed a statement that we then submitted. And Connie was a part of that too, Connie LeBrun. So you'd think this would be obvious, but it wasn't until 2011 that the statement was approved by the IOC Medical Commission in 2011, saying that no female athlete should be denied the opportunity to participate in any Olympic sport on the basis that she might sustain an injury to her reproductive organs. A survey of injury data has failed to find any evidence of an increased risk for acute or chronic damage to the female reproductive organs occurring as a direct result from participation in sport. So 2014, common sense finally prevailed, and ski jumping was added for women in Sochi. We had some issues and interesting discussions about hyperandrogenism, female hyperandrogenism. We were convened in 2010, and the IAAF was there. It was an extremely interesting symposium with experts and lawyers and a person from the Intersex International Organization was present, and a lot of just discussion about what constitute female and male, what's fair, what's not fair, what levels of different hormones should be, and just was a very interesting perspective on different levels of different hormones in men and women. And here's Arnie in the red tie, and Arnie is unfortunately not unfortunately, but he is giving a talk next door in Auditorium A right now at the same time frame as this one. So he does wish his best to Barbara and apologizes that he was not able to attend. So that kind of morphed into the DSD, Disorders of Sex Development, and a conference in 2010 with WSI-ACSM, Disorders of Sexual Differentiation, that was in Baltimore, and then again in IOC with athletes with disorders of sex development and their participation in competitive sport. And that had a lot to do, this was after the recent Caster Semenya, who I just talked with a friend who has stated that she's on a resurgent back in her 800-meter issues because of some problems with a congenital anomaly. Hyperandrogenism and transgender issues in sport. This is Margot Mountjoy, who also happens to be next door. You can see Barbara laughing, as always, and smiling. This was San Fran in 2012. She felt very strongly about fairness in sport. So the consensus statement in 2012 focused on the current science and what to recommend if an athlete was diagnosed with a disorder of sexual differentiation. And the concern was with the elite athlete and whether some disorders might provide a woman with an unfair advantage in competition. And successfully, there was no sexual differentiation controversies in London about a male trying to compete as a female, or vice versa, I guess could happen. Now, granted, there are 23 samples that are being retested, but we don't think that's going to be a sexual differentiation issue. Back in 2011, Badminton World Federation mandated that women playing in international tournaments wear skirts to ensure attractive presentation of badminton. Same thing pretty much happened in beach volleyball with their 2 1/4 requirement of the, of the bottoms. So the BWF is in for a rude awakening if they think that women will meekly accept being used as a sex object to boost the sport's profile among viewers. All are athletes and should be appreciated for their skill, not their wardrobe. And I think they would have frozen to death in London in 2012 for beach volleyball because it was really cold. So in June 2011, the badminton world governing body decided to scrap the rule to force female players to wear skirts in competition. Here we are in Glasgow, there's Connie, and Barbara would always say it's fine if women have to wear skirts as long as men do too. So that was ICSIMIS, the International Convention on Science, Education, and Medicine and Sport, and we did some body image and medical sequelae in the elite female athlete. And there's urine. Urine is here, urine is there, urine is everywhere. I do urinary incontinence tomorrow, and there's urine is again. So I appreciate urine being present, and I wish my legs looked like that. And then we mentioned about the dog thing. It's here's the actual beachcomber that you referred to, the Wall Street Journal of Vashon Island. It includes Maury Island as well. And front page cover girl, but actually it's really the dog that's being featured, Duke, and notice it says Retired Physiologist Rescue Center. So I think Duke did a very good job of trying to rescue this retired physiologist, Barbara Drinkwater. Same kind of quote, none of VIP's 30 years of work would have been possible if not for the work of one woman credited for founding the organization, served as its president for 30 years, and continues to serve on its board, Barbara Drinkwater. So this is a very passionate aspect of Barbara Drinkwater, and she's worked tirelessly to place both cats and dogs all over from Vashon Island. I did wear on purpose my dog collar scarf that I think I purchased from the little cart that rolls up and down the jet on our way to Frankfurt. And I said, well, Barbara, I don't know, it's kind of expensive. And she says, it's duty free. So here's a picture of beautiful Vashon Island, very wild and interesting. So some of the other societies that Barbara was a member of that you may not be quite as familiar with include the Dapper Suit Society, of which she was always front and center. She also coerced me to join her book club, Reading Between the Wines. Here we have Toby, Mindy, Barb, and Molly. The Hug-a-Doc group, you can see Anne and Barb. And this is one of the better photographs from Barb's Photography 101 class. And also, we were members of the Sisterhood of the Traveling White Pants. And there's Kate Ackerman on the far right. And many people aren't aware that Barbara was actually Miss America in 2013, and here she's receiving her rose bouquet. And you can see her face. She took a little bit of a punch. I think she hit the table too hard, and somebody didn't like that and tried to take her out, so we had to hire a bodyguard. So we looked to our local and popular thug, John Patricios, to help maintain her protection throughout the rest of the conference. That's my husband Doug in the background, and he is a cosmetic as well as eye surgeon of oculoplastics, and fixed her brow and eyelid up very nicely. And here's Barb. This is the banquet observation requires enthusiasm team. with also the Pink Ladies. And here's Rosemary and Connie, and this is in Denver in 2011. Why did I say Fry? I'm sorry, I don't know what that, Agostini. So, and we wish her well too in her recovery from her pulmonary condition. So Barbara Drinkwater served as ACSM's first female president, as you all have heard, and ACSM established a fund in her name to make possible an important opportunity for scientific discovery and clinical progress in the vital area of women's health. And that's the Barbara Drinkwater Research Fund. And you're asked every year when you join if you'd like to donate, and you certainly can. It's an excellent cause. Mindy helped set that up, and thanks to her for doing that. So I was in and out of ACSM, and one time getting fellowship, it's like, well, I guess I can be more involved. And then it's like Barb says, well, hold on to your hat. And from then on, I was running around a lot. So just as Aurelia pointed out, she really does get you involved and get you going just on nonstop with whatever you can do or can't do. So I think, you know, the old quote, she talks the talk. She's more than a researcher. She's also an advocate, a lobbyist, a diplomat, and a policymaker. She's a woman of action for equality, all who are underrepresented. She defines collegial in its purest sense, and she will share with you and do whatever she can to make you better and whatever you're studying better. She encourages clinical application and MDs in ACSM. She also walks the walk. She's a passionate humanitarian and a mentor. She's a role model for all scientists, and that's not gender specific. She has infectious energy. Good luck trying to keep up with her at times when you're carrying a bag of golf clubs for 18 holes when you're 89. She's bright, witty, and has a very positive humor. So I likened her more to a Gore-Tex jacket. It's non-porous. So smooth, protective, breathable, practical, non-flammable, and enduring. She's an all-weather, comfortable, true friend who has greatly impacted my life. One of her last quotes talking to her recently, obviously I'm a born troublemaker. It's fun to revisit some of the battles. It's late, let's talk more tomorrow. And her warning to me, watch your step, girl. Remember, I get to have the last word in Boston, although now that will be in Denver, where we'll have a reception to honor Barbara next year when she's present, which she will be in Denver. So thank you very much from the bottom of my heart and from, I think, everyone else here to Barbara Drinkwater.
Wow, those are some fabulous presentations. Don't you agree, Barbara? So we have about 15 minutes, and I'm going to be closing the symposium with a short video. But I would like to invite you to join us at the microphone, to join us with any questions you may have or comments or reflections of your interactions with Barbara. Please say your name and where you're from so Barbara can know who's contributing. I just would like to make one note, and I'll just add is, when we started the mentoring program in ACSM, we were sitting around and people were talking about why we needed a women mentoring women program back then, and this one gal said, well, I can tell you last year, the highlight of my ACSM meeting was riding in the elevator with Barbara Drinkwater. So certainly we got that going. Okay, now, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, thanks. My name is Patricia Sanjanis. I am from Buenos Aires, Argentina, and I would like to share with you some memories with Barbara. For many of you who are from the States, it's really clear that she was a real mentor. But for physicians or scientists from abroad, she was also a great mentor and inspirational. I remember many years ago, I was already a physician in the International Federation of Sports Medicine. I went to a lecture in ACSM where Barbara showed that the medical commission of the IOC was only formed by males, by male physician. And she was very emphatic, saying, there should be a woman. Well, that's what's a picture for me, but very inspirational. So I went back to Buenos Aires. I had an interview with the president of the Olympic Committee of Argentina, and I said, do you think it's possible? So we presented the credentials, and after many interviews, and because of the inspiration of Barbara, I became the first female physician of the IOC Medical Commission. So it's 20 years now. It was in '97. And when I was there, then Barbara came and said, well, Patricia, now you are in the Medical Commission. We have to make a document on the triad, and we have to make a consensus statement. So we are going to invite all the scientists to a meeting in Lausanne. And I said, all the people that I know about because of their lectures, you have to call them and ask them to come to this meeting in the IOC. And she took the phone personally and convoked most of you to the first document of the IOC, the first consensus statement. And thanks to Barbara, the first and the ones who followed were produced by the IOC Medical Commission. So, not to be so long, my personal thanks from the foreign people, who she also has been a mentor and inspirational for us. And we share the last banquet at San Diego. We all want to share the next in Denver. So, keep healthy, Barb. We'll see you in Denver. Thanks to all.
We all have so many remembrances. Please go ahead and share yours.
Kathy Little, Cleveland State University. I would just like to share a little tidbit. When I was a graduate student at Kent State in the 80s, and Wayne Sinning was my mentor, and many of you probably know he passed away this past October. But Wayne was a champion of women in exercise science. But what he did for the women at Kent State, one particular year, mid to late 80s, at one of the ACSMs, he asked Barbara to have lunch with the women graduates, only the women graduate students at Kent State. He paid for the lunch. And I think that's just a testament to the mentorship of Barbara, as well as the mentorship of my mentor, Wayne Sinning.
Thank you.
My first meeting with Barbara was...
Oh, can you introduce yourself? Excuse me.
Jorunn Sundgodt-Borgen from Oslo, Norway. My first meeting with Barbara was at the conference, at the ACSM conference, and that was my first conference in '92. And I presented my doctoral work, and that was on eating disorder. And when I finished, she and Jack Wilmore said, oh, we need you. And I was almost in shock. I read about this woman for years, and then I finally met her. And she also told me, oh, you are from Norway? You have those extremely good runners. We had Grete Waitz, and you probably recognize our long-distance runners. And she said, you have to care for their bone mass. So she actually came to Oslo and attended a conference in relation to a race that we arranged for our best runners. And she was at our university. And we were having lunch in the cantina, and I ordered a sandwich and a Diet Coke. And she said, are you serious? And I couldn't understand what she meant. You cannot order Diet Coke. You have to have milk in front of your students, Jorunn. So since then, I'm trying to, although I don't like this meal.
Thank you.
Hi, Connie Lebrun from Canada. So I first met Barbara before 2000, and it was on the dock in Kona, Hawaii. And I was there for a sports medicine conference, and she was there for a different sports medicine conference. And she sort of looked me up and down and she said, I've appointed you to a committee called Healthy People 2000. And when ACSM calls, you will serve. And that was the beginning of my experiences with ACSM. So when I was applying to be a fellow, I asked her to be a reference, and she was kind enough to do that. And she's just been a tremendous role model for all of us, physicians, scientists, females, males. She's amazing.
Thanks, Connie. I remember as a young assistant professor at an ACSM meeting receiving an invitation from Barbara to meet with her because she wanted to develop a questionnaire to measure bone density and to identify the types of sports and activities that women did in order to predict their risk for bone problems. And so we sat there and we actually met in her hotel room, and I tell you, I was shaking in my boots. You know, here's this Barbara Drinkwater asking me to help her. My gosh. And that project moved along, and it took quite a while, but it moved along, and then by then I was unable to do it, but I passed it on to Janet Shaw from the University of Utah, who was a student of mine, or ours then at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and Janet now was on the faculty in Utah. And then she was busy and passed it on to her student. And all of us together, though, stayed in touch, and we finally did a study to use that bone loading questionnaire and published results in MSSC some 10 years later. So I think the Barbara's reach goes way long and way wide in many ways. I really thank you for your contributions to this symposium. Let me just share with you in conclusion, can you make that next group available? About the Barbara Drinkwater Research Fund that Sue mentioned, Mindy Millard Stafford set up when she was president. And this is a video that invites all of us to contribute to the fund.
She's like a giant in my mind.
She's a mentor and a legend for students everywhere. Her research is still breaking barriers.
She's opened the doors for generations of women.
I've changed my research focus because of her inspiring work.
She has lived her passion.
She truly is a trailblazer. You've heard phrases like charting the course or pioneering the way. By being a member of ACSM, you are instantly associated with past, present, and future leaders in sports medicine and exercise science. Essentially, you already are a trailblazer and are beginning to carve your own legacy. ACSM is an association that boasts many industry pioneers, one of whom is still active in the research world today, Dr. Barbara Drinkwater. By giving to the Barbara Drinkwater Research Fund, you are essentially working alongside her, sustaining her work. Dr. Drinkwater is legendary in the field of female sports medicine and was ACSM's first female president. So when you support the growth of this fund, you are supporting research on women in sports as a whole. With your generosity and financial commitment, the Drinkwater Research Fund can begin funding future leaders in the field of women's health.
It is the female athlete who pushes the borders. It's their determination that forces acceptance of their desire to be the best.
Consider a contribution to the ACSM Foundation, especially the Drinkwater Research Fund. By leaving your mark through the ACSM Foundation, you are your own trailblazer.
We certainly can contribute to the legacy of the Drinkwater Research Fund as we consider our next donations. I want to thank all of our participants and our speakers for that were part of the symposium today, especially Aurelia. At the last minute, I think it was Friday, I sent you an email, and then I said, Rosemary's sick and she can't come. Can you join us? I know this is last minute. And she said, oh my goodness, it sure is, but I'm there. So thank you so much. And thank you all for spending the last 2 hours with us to honor the research and recognize Barbara Drinkwater as a giant in our field. Thank you.